For centuries, human beings have tried to answer one enormous question. Where are the deepest roots of our species? It sounds like a simple question, but modern genetics has made the answer far more complicated. DNA cannot legitimately rank human races from oldest to youngest, because every living human population is equally modern, and every population has continued evolving throughout its history. What scientists can measure is something more precise: genetic diversity, population structure, and how deeply particular ancestral lineages branch within the human family tree. When researchers compare populations across the world, one pattern appears again and again. African populations contain the greatest overall human genetic diversity, while populations outside Africa generally carry only a subset of that variation because their ancestors passed through demographic bottlenecks during ancient migrations. Within Africa, some populations preserve especially deep genetic lineages, and among the most important are the Khoisan peoples of southern Africa. Their genomes contain extraordinary diversity and evidence of population splits that occurred extremely deep in human history. But the real surprise is not that they are an old race. That description is scientifically wrong. The real surprise is that living communities in southern Africa preserve clues to parts of human history that became harder to detect elsewhere. Their DNA helps reveal how our species divided, migrated, adapted, and mixed long before cities, writing, or recorded history existed. The deeper scientists look, the clearer it becomes that the human story is not a ladder with older people at one end and younger people at the other. It is a network of populations, each carrying different pieces of one shared past. To understand what scientists mean by genetic diversity, imagine two populations with the same number of people. In one population, most individuals carry very similar versions of the same genes. In the other, individuals carry many different variants. The second population has greater genetic diversity. Researchers can measure this using statistics such as nucleotide diversity, heterozygosity, and the number and distribution of rare variants. These measurements can reveal clues about population size, migration, selection, and ancient separation. But there is an important catch. High diversity does not automatically tell us that a population has existed unchanged in one place for a particular number of years. Mutation rates vary, demographic histories are complicated, and natural selection can preserve or remove variants. A population can experience a severe bottleneck and later recover. Another population can receive migrants and suddenly become more diverse. That is why scientists do not literally calculate a person's DNA age. They infer population history from patterns in the genome. When several independent measurements point toward deep ancestry and long-term population structure, scientists gain stronger confidence that the population preserves ancient branches of human history. This is why certain African populations consistently stand out. Their diversity is not evidence that they are superior, more intelligent, or more evolved. It is evidence that their ancestors experienced a long and complex history within Africa, the continent where Homo sapiens emerged. The broadest pattern is one of the strongest conclusions in human population genetics. Africa contains more human genetic diversity than any other continent. The reason is fundamentally connected to time. Modern humans evolved in Africa, and populations there have been living, separating, mixing, and adapting for far longer than populations outside Africa. Eventually, groups moved into Eurasia, and later into Australia and the Americas. Those migrations were generally founded by relatively small populations. A small group cannot carry every genetic variant present in the much larger population it leaves behind. This creates a founder effect and often a population bottleneck. The descendants of those migrants begin with a narrower slice of the genetic variation available in Africa. The analogy is simple, imagine a giant library containing 10,000 books. A small group leaves with 500 books and establishes a new library elsewhere. That new library can grow, and it can acquire new books over time, but it begins with a narrower collection than the original. The same basic principle shaped human genetic diversity. European, East Asian, and indigenous American populations all preserve rich variation, but their ancestors carried only part of the much broader variation found across Africa. Later migrations, gene flow, and selection changed those populations, but the underlying demographic signature of the ancient expansion remains visible today. Within Africa, however, there is no single genetic population. The continent contains extraordinary differences between groups separated by geography, language, ecology, and demographic history. Populations from East Africa can differ substantially from those in West Africa. Southern African communities preserve some of the deepest population divisions known among living humans. The Khoisan are particularly important because genome-wide studies have repeatedly found that several of their lineages diverged from other populations extremely deeply in time. Different studies produce different estimates, and scientists continue to debate exactly when particular branches separated. Some models place major Khoisan population splits more than 100,000 years ago, while others emphasize continued gene flow after those initial divergences. That uncertainty is normal. The further scientists look into the past, the more difficult it becomes to estimate exact dates. Mutation rate assumptions, population sizes, migrations, and later admixture can all shift the results. The key conclusion does not depend on one precise number. Khoisan populations preserve exceptionally deep genetic structure and unusually high diversity compared with many other living populations. That makes them enormously valuable for reconstructing early human history. But it does not mean they are unchanged descendants of the first humans, or that every modern Khoisan person carries exactly the same ancient ancestry. Like every other population, they have continued evolving. Mitochondrial DNA provides one of the clearest examples of these deep lineages. Because mitochondria are transmitted through the maternal line, mitochondrial DNA allows researchers to follow particular branches of ancestry over long periods. Southern African populations carry some of the deepest mitochondrial lineages known today, including branches associated with haplogroup L0. These maternal lineages are very old and preserve information about ancient population structure in Africa. But a mitochondrial haplogroup represents only one maternal line. It is not a complete record of a person's ancestry. Imagine tracing your mother, then her mother, then her mother, and continuing backward. Eventually, you reach one particular ancient woman whose mitochondrial DNA survives in your line. But that woman was only one of thousands of ancestors contributing to your entire genome at that time. Her mitochondrial DNA is therefore a single thread, not the whole fabric. The same principle applies to Y-chromosome lineages, which follow one paternal line. Some of the deepest Y-chromosome branches are African, but they do not represent entire populations. Modern whole genome sequencing is powerful because it combines these one-line markers with millions of autosomal variants inherited from thousands of ancestors. The result is a much more complete picture of population history. One reason the Khoisan are so important is that their genomes show both ancient separation and later connection. Some groups diverged from neighboring populations very deeply, but that did not mean they stopped interacting forever. Gene flow occurred between populations at different times. Some Khoisan communities received ancestry from neighboring Bantu-speaking populations, while other groups remained more genetically distinct. This is an important correction to the popular idea of an isolated ancient population. Isolation is rarely absolute. Human populations are constantly moving at some level. Even groups that remain geographically distinct can exchange genes with neighboring communities over thousands of years. The Khoisan genetic story therefore looks more like a braided river than a straight branch. Some channels separated, some reconnected, some became much smaller, others expanded. The modern populations preserve pieces of several of those processes. This is exactly what scientists expect from real human evolution. Populations were never perfectly sealed boxes. They responded to climate, food availability, disease, migration, and social change. The Khoisan survived through all of those processes. Their deep genetic structure is therefore not evidence that evolution stopped for them. It is evidence that some ancient branches remained visible while they continued changing. The same principle explains why populations outside Africa often show lower overall genetic diversity without being biologically less complex. European populations experienced ancient founding events and later migrations that reshaped their genetic landscape. East Asian populations experienced their own founder effects and regional expansions. Indigenous American populations descended from relatively small founding groups that moved through Northeast Asia and Beringia before expanding throughout the Americas. Pacific populations experienced dramatic founder events during long-distance oceanic migration. These demographic events reduced some components of ancestral diversity, but they also created new evolutionary pathways. Once populations reached new environments, natural selection altered gene frequencies. Europeans developed adaptations connected to northern sunlight, and, in some populations, adult milk digestion. Tibetans developed remarkable high-altitude adaptations. East Asian populations developed their own regional physiological variants. Indigenous American populations evolved adaptations to local climates and diets. None of this means one group became more advanced than another. Each population experienced different pressures. Founder effects shaped what variation was available, and natural selection then acted on that variation. The result was diversity, not hierarchy. South Asia demonstrates how complicated the story becomes when migration routes overlap. Modern populations across India preserve multiple layers of ancestry resulting from ancient population structure and later gene flow. Some groups retain deep ancestry associated with populations that diverged early in the history of modern humans, while others have substantial ancestry from later migrants associated with Central Asia, West Eurasia, East Asia, or neighboring South Asian populations. The Indian subcontinent was positioned close to major routes connecting Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia. This made it a long-term crossroads. Populations entered, remained, mixed, separated, and sometimes expanded into new regions. Because of this, the genetic diversity of South Asia cannot be summarized by one number or one ancestry group. The same is true of the Middle East. The region was a major corridor for the expansion of Homo sapiens into Eurasia, and later became a crossroads connecting Africa, Asia, and Europe. Modern Middle Eastern populations therefore preserve combinations of ancestry produced by many waves of migration. These examples show why genetic diversity is better understood as a map than as a ranking. Africa sits at the center of the deepest diversity, while different regions around the world preserve different combinations created by migration and demographic history. One of the strongest reasons scientists care about highly diverse African populations is that they contain genetic variants that are rare or absent in populations elsewhere. As more African genomes are sequenced, researchers repeatedly discover new variants that were missing from earlier reference data sets. Large projects involving southern African populations have identified millions of previously unreported genetic differences. This matters enormously for modern medicine. For many years, major genome-wide association studies were dominated by participants of European ancestry. That allowed scientists to discover important disease-associated variants, but it also meant that variants specific to or more common in African populations could be missed. If a variant is rare in European samples, researchers may not have enough statistical power to detect its importance. African genomic research is helping correct this imbalance. The Khoisan are especially valuable because their genomes preserve some of the deepest genetic variation known among living humans. Studying this variation can reveal biological mechanisms related to disease, immune function, metabolism, and adaptation. But there is an ethical responsibility attached to that research. Indigenous and historically marginalized populations have often been exploited by scientists. So modern genomics increasingly emphasizes informed consent, community participation, secure data systems, and respect for cultural rights. The value of a genome never outweighs the rights of the person or community who carries it. Ancient adaptation provides another reason genetic diversity matters. One of the clearest examples is the sickle cell variant in the HBB gene. When a person inherits one copy, they have sickle cell trait rather than full sickle cell disease. When two copies are inherited, the condition can become severe. Why did a potentially harmful variant become common? In regions where malaria was widespread, individuals with one copy had greater protection against severe malaria. They were more likely to survive and reproduce, so the variant became more common. This is a classic example of balancing selection. The same allele can be beneficial in one genetic state and harmful in another. The lesson is not that African populations developed a better gene. It is that natural selection responded to an environmental challenge. Similar principles explain other African adaptations, including variants affecting immunity and parasite resistance. APOL1 is one example. Certain APOL1 variants became more common in parts of sub-Saharan Africa because they improved protection against certain trypanosome parasites associated with sleeping sickness. Yet, inheriting two high-risk variants can increase the risk of kidney disease. Again, evolution created a trade-off. An ancient survival advantage can become a modern health risk. Population genetics, therefore, gives us a way to understand how environmental history remains visible inside living people. This also demonstrates why the phrase oldest DNA can be dangerously misleading. A genetic variant that is extremely old is not automatically beneficial, unique, or present in every member of a population. Some variants survive because they are useful. Others survive because they are neutral. Still others persist simply because demographic history protected them from disappearing. A high-diversity population contains many different evolutionary outcomes. Some are adaptive, some are not. Some may never have had a noticeable effect on survival. The human genome is full of variation that exists simply because evolution is not a perfectly optimized system. Genetic drift can preserve or eliminate variants randomly, especially in smaller populations. Natural selection can favor certain variants under specific conditions. Migration can move them into completely different environments. That means a population's genetic diversity is a record of chance and selection happening together. This is why scientists need demographic models rather than simple mutation counting. They are trying to understand not only how much variation exists, but why it exists. The idea that one population can be older than another also breaks down when we examine population splitting. Imagine two populations diverging 100,000 years ago. That does not mean one population is 100,000 years old and the other is younger. Both have been evolving continuously since the split. The branch point tells us when their ancestors became increasingly separate, not when the populations themselves suddenly appeared. This is why scientists describe some African groups as deeply diverged rather than ancient people. The people living today are modern, Their ancestors experienced the same evolutionary processes as everyone else. A modern Khoisan individual is not a living specimen from the Stone Age. They are a contemporary human carrying ancestry from population branches that remained unusually deep. This distinction is essential because the phrase living fossil has been used irresponsibly in popular culture. It reduces living communities to objects of scientific curiosity and ignores the fact that they have their own histories, languages, cultures, and modern lives. Their value to science comes from what their genomes reveal about population history, not from any supposed biological primitiveness. The Khoisan also offers insight into the broader structure of African population history. Africa contains some of the oldest population separations known among living humans, but those separations did not produce neatly bounded groups. Gene flow continued across many regions. Ancient populations moved, married, and interacted. Climate changes repeatedly altered the size and distribution of populations. Some groups became isolated when environments changed and reconnected when conditions improved. This means the African genetic landscape is not a straight ladder either. It is a network of branches. The deep diversity preserved in southern Africa is only one part of the larger picture. East African populations carry their own ancient signals. West African populations contain enormous diversity and complex relationships among language groups. Central African populations have their own demographic histories, including interactions among forest peoples, agriculturalists, and neighboring communities. To understand human origins properly, scientists need all of these populations. Focusing on one oldest group would actually make the story less accurate, because the origin of our species involved many populations rather than a single founding tribe. Genetic diversity also helps explain why Africa is so important to studies of human disease. When researchers sequence more African populations, they discover variants that were missing from older medical databases. Some of these variants may influence drug metabolism, immune function, or disease susceptibility. This matters because clinical trials and genetic prediction models have historically relied heavily on European ancestry. A model trained on European populations can perform less accurately when applied to Africans because the underlying variant frequencies and linkage patterns differ. Scientists are now working to build more globally representative genomic resources. The goal is not to create separate medicine for different races. It is to understand human biology accurately enough that every patient benefits. A person's ancestry can provide context, but direct genetic information is far more precise. The Khoisan and other highly diverse populations, therefore, represent an enormous scientific resource, but that resource should be studied ethically and with the participation of the communities themselves. There is another reason genetic diversity matters: the future. Populations with small sizes can lose genetic variation rapidly. When rare variants disappear, some biological information disappears with them. This is one reason conservation biologists worry about endangered species with severe population bottlenecks. Human populations can face similar demographic risks. If a small community experiences major population decline, unique genetic variants may become much rarer or disappear entirely. Preserving communities and respecting their rights can therefore help preserve human genetic diversity. But preservation must never mean freezing people in place. Human communities have the right to change, migrate, marry, adapt, and make their own decisions. Genetics should be used to understand human history, not to justify controlling it. This is especially important for indigenous populations whose genomes have historically been collected without sufficient consent. The future of human genomics depends as much on ethical practice as on sequencing technology. The population genetics of the Americas provides one more demonstration of how migration changes diversity. Indigenous American populations descend from ancestral populations that moved into the Americas through Beringia and then expanded southward. Founder effects reduced some genetic diversity compared with the wider populations in Northeast Asia. Later migrations and regional isolation created additional differences. Some indigenous communities therefore carry very distinctive genetic variants that developed after their ancestors entered the Americas. Again, this does not mean they are younger people in any meaningful human sense. Their population structure is the result of a specific migration history. The same principle applies to Polynesian populations, island communities, and many other groups that went through founder events. Human populations constantly change in response to geography. The genome remembers these movements because genetic drift and selection alter frequencies in predictable ways. By studying the pattern today, researchers can infer parts of the journey that happened thousands of years ago. The famous out-of-Africa model itself is also more complicated than many people were taught. There was probably not one single migration in which every non-African population originated at exactly the same time from exactly the same group. There is evidence for earlier dispersals of Homo sapiens out of Africa, some of which may have contributed little to later populations. Later movements produced much of the ancestry found outside Africa today. Populations met other human groups, including Neanderthals and Denisovans, and exchanged genes. Some populations that left Africa may have disappeared, while others became ancestors of later communities. This means Africa preserved not only the ancestors of today's non-Africans, but also many lineages that never participated in the major global expansion. The high diversity of African populations is therefore partly a record of what the rest of humanity lost during migration. That makes the continent essential to understanding our origins. Some researchers have also proposed that modern African populations contain small contributions from ancient ghost hominins whose fossils have not yet been identified. These models attempt to explain genetic segments that appear too deeply diverged to come from known modern human populations. Such research remains an active area of debate, and not every unusual pattern necessarily proves interbreeding with an unknown species. Deep ancestral population structure can sometimes create similar signals, but the possibility is compelling because Africa's fossil and ancient DNA record is incomplete. Warm climates often destroy DNA, and entire populations could have disappeared without leaving recoverable genetic material. If modern genomes preserve traces of those populations, geneticists may be able to infer their existence even before archaeology finds their bones. This possibility means that the African story may contain even more branches than scientists currently recognize. The human family tree may therefore grow more complicated as new genomes and computational methods are developed. So if scientists cannot actually rank every race by DNA age, why does the idea remain so attractive? Because people naturally want simple answers to enormous questions. They want to know who came first, who is closest to the origin, and which population has the oldest ancestry. But evolution rarely gives simple answers. The Khoisan preserves some of the deepest living human lineages, but so do other African populations in different ways. African diversity is not concentrated in one tribe. It is distributed across a continent. The oldest lineages are not a single group. They are many branches of a much larger network. That is more complicated than a ranking, but it is also much more scientifically meaningful. Instead of asking who is oldest, we can ask which population structures diverged earliest, which lineages remained isolated, which groups exchanged genes, and how migration reshaped diversity. Those questions produce actual scientific knowledge. The deeper lesson is that human genetic history is a story of both continuity and change. Africa preserved the greatest overall diversity because it contains the deepest population history of our species. Outside Africa, founder effects narrowed some of that variation as small groups migrated into new territories. Those migrant populations then evolved new adaptations, encountered other humans, and developed new forms of diversity. The branches became different without becoming separate species. Some mixed again, some vanished, others expanded. Today, every living population contains evidence of this process. The Khoisan are important because their genomes preserve especially deep branches, but they are not outside the modern world, and they are not trapped in an ancient past. Their people have modern lives, modern challenges, and modern identities. The genetic information simply gives scientists another window into the deep past. And perhaps that is the real reason their DNA shocks researchers. Not because it proves one group is older than everyone else, but because it reminds us that the roots of humanity are still alive. The deepest branches of our genetic history are not confined to fossils. They exist in living people. Their genomes carry signals from population splits that occurred tens of thousands of years ago, long before agriculture, cities, writing, or nations. Those signals survived through generations because populations remained large enough, distinct enough, or connected in ways that preserved them. The people who carry them did not choose that history. They inherited it. You are carrying ancient mutations. You are carrying the consequences of migration. You are carrying traces of environments your ancestors may have lived in thousands of years ago. And somewhere in your genome are genetic branches shared with people who lived before recorded history. That is what genetic age really means. It does not mean one race is older. It means some lineages have remained separate for longer. It means some populations preserved more variation. It means other populations passed through bottlenecks and carried away only a fraction of what existed before. It means the genome is a record of movement, not a ranking, not a hierarchy, a map. And when scientists follow that map backward, the deepest and most diverse routes repeatedly lead to Africa. The Khoisan are one of the clearest windows into that ancient history. Their genomes preserve extraordinary diversity and deeply branching lineages, while also showing evidence of later interaction with neighboring populations. They are not living fossils. They are modern people carrying an unusually rich genetic record. Their DNA helps scientists reconstruct the structure of early Homo sapiens populations and understand how later migrations reshaped the world. Their story also reminds us that the term oldest race is not just scientifically inaccurate, it misses the real wonder. Human beings did not appear as separate races that formed one after another. We emerged as structured populations within Africa, changed through time, and eventually spread into every major region of the planet. That means the deepest human ancestry is not something that belongs to one modern group. It belongs to all of us. Africa holds the greatest diversity because it preserves the longest and most complex history of our species. The populations that stayed preserved much of that diversity. The populations that left carried part of it. And the world we see today is the result. The final surprise is therefore not that the Khoisan are older. The surprise is that every population outside Africa carries evidence of a journey that began there. Every European, every East Asian, every indigenous American, every Pacific Islander, every person alive today, different branches, different histories, different adaptations, but one species, one ancient beginning, and a genetic story that is still being written.